Okay. I'm very pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Mark Levene as our keynote speaker today. Mark is Emeritus Fellow in History at the University of Southampton. He received his PhD in history from Oxford in 1981, and since then he has taught at the University of Warwick and Southampton, where he also served as chair of the Boards of Studies for Jewish History and Culture and was a member of the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations. Having begun his career researching modern Jewish history and comparative history, Mark has since shifted his focus towards interpreting the nature of such global phenomena as genocide, mass violence, and most recently, individual experiences in the face of the ongoing climate crisis. Mark is unsurprisingly a prolific author and has written numerous articles and highly acclaimed monographs. One of his early co-edited collections, entitled The Massacre in History from 1999, examines the historical role of the massacre since the biblical times to ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia during the 1990s, arguing that such processes are often central to the course of human development and societal change. His seminal multi-volume study, Genocide in the Age of the Nation States from 2005, set out the main conceptual issues in the study of genocide, addressing the fundamental problems of defining genocide and understanding what we mean by perpetrators and victims. His magisterial two-volume work, The Times of Genocide from 2014, for which Mark received the biennial Lemkin Award from the New York-based Institute for the Study of Genocide in 2015, provides a synthesized, impressively broad and erudite reading of the latest literature on a vast array of movements and events contributing to acts of genocide and mass violence. In line with his previous research, he authoritatively claims that genocide is not an aberrant phenomenon in modern history, but is integral to the historical trajectory of development towards nation states. Of particular relevance to our study group is Mark's primary interest in mass violence, specifically against communities who suddenly found themselves as minorities within the borders of nation states in those areas of Europe defined as Rimlands, stretching west to east from the Balkans to the Caucasus and north to south from the Baltics through the lands of historic Poland to the Black Sea. When explaining his research, Mark once said that, and I quote, "I am trying to merge in my writing a concern for things which should matter a great deal, like where we're going and why, with some sort of academic detachment. I suspect this will be an impossible task. The global and local challenges which face us as we approach the millennium, however, will require more than academic pronouncements. I think I'm probably concerned to be something other than simply a chronicler of a declining, increasingly cannibalistic species." End of quote. That said, throughout his work, Mark has also become an environmental and peace activist, exploring the wider underpinnings of conflict and crisis in the modern world. To this end, he is one of the initiators of the Rescue History Forum that seeks to unite academics and activists against the projected danger of anthroposophic climate change. It is these particular concerns that Mark will be examining in his opening keynote address, entitled Prequel to Global Catastrophe, the Dissolution of Minority Peoples Through the Lens of Climate Crisis. Mark, thank you once again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great. First of all, before I say anything, can you all hear me? Yeah? Good, great. Elena, that was terribly nice, thank you, and seems to build me up into something much more grandiose than I really am. I'd like to just say to Elena, thank you for having me, for the invite today. I should say that despite what you've just done, I don't see myself as part of any great academic circuit. And I am very much out of things in many ways these days. So I'd like to say, Elena, thank you for taking the risk and for having such a nice smile too. It's a delight to meet you at long last. Anyway, let's proceed. I better put my glasses on for this, I think. On the 13th of September, 1922, 4 days after the Turkish army's arrival in the great cosmopolitan Aegean port of Smyrna, most of the city began to go up in flames. A massive and intense conflagration lasting up to 10 days. Hundreds of thousands of mostly Greek and Armenian people, mostly women and children, and the old, those, that is, who had not been extinguished in the flames, or were murdered, raped, or marched off for a slower, lingering death in the Anatolian interior, found themselves caught on the waterfront between death in the inferno or death by drowning. As night after night, they waited for rescue in what must have seemed like an eternity. What happened at Smyrna was, as we know, the culmination of the most vicious, many-sided war, indeed wars for the body and soul of Anatolia, and for the Greeks, not only the final nail in the coffin of any grandiose ideas of megali idea, but an event marking a very nearly final foreclosure on a several millennia-long Hellenic presence in Asia Minor. Yet, as caught by the cameras of all the witnesses on the array of international ships out in the harbor, the impact of this Smyrna Holocaust, as it was described at the time, the prevalent feel was of something more than even Greek tragedy. Was this not a premonition a la Bosch, Bruegel, or the English 19th century apocalyptic romanticist John Martin of the very end of the world? Finalities, however, can come in many unexpected shapes and nightmarish forms. Indeed, they can also come by stealth in the middle of the night, as happened 21 years after the Smyrna events on 4th of March, 1943. Thus ended the Jewish community in Xanthi, 200 miles northwest of today's Izmir, or 8 hours drive away. A Western Thracian, also once Ottoman, also once richly multi-ethnic town, it happens to have come to play a significant part in my own life. But minus any wealthy Jewish tobacco traders, literati, or Maccabee sports club youngsters to greet me on my return. Nearly every one of Xanthi's 550 recorded Jewish inhabitants disappeared from its public life, its economy, its schools, its intimate hubbub of social, religious, and linguistic interactions within the time it takes to hastily pack a suitcase. Consumed alongside all the other little Sephardi communities of so-called Belamuri, the Greek zone of wartime Bulgarian occupation, in an operation organized by Sophia's Commissariat of Jewish Affairs, and whose final destination a few weeks later would be the gas chambers at Treblinka, the handful of survivors not swept up in the 4th March dragnet, albeit from this very small piece of the Holocaust jigsaw, were too pitifully few in numbers to recreate a community. Like the Regent honey eater, a stunningly beautiful Eastern Australian songbird, so reduced in numbers by anthropogenic pressures, and thus fragmented in its natural range, that most of them, as recent research has shown, have forgotten their soft, warbling, authentic song. The last few thus reduced to singing garbled tunes they have learnt from other bird species. Even then, yet further overwhelmed by the 2019-20 Australian Black Summer of bushfires. So too, the story of Xanthi's Jewish post-disaster, clinging on for dear life could only end in a deafening silence. What lexicon can we turn to articulate the coming and actuality of such endings? Historians speaking of such events might utter words such as extermination, catastrophe, genocide, Holocaust. Now, when environmentalists and earth scientists use more Anthropocene speak, it often conjures up a more clinical, yet eerily final quality. Threshold, tipping point, ecosystem perturbation, heralding not just the loss of diverse biota. After all, regent honeybirds' decline matters because without their pollination of eucalyptus flowers, other bird and animal species, which in turn depend on this majestic plant for their own flourishing, will be unable to do so. Hence the road to wholesale population collapse widens, perhaps en route to what is now scientifically forecast as an epochal sixth extinction of planetary life forms. The English naturalist Robert Macfarlane has felt compelled to create a new glossary for this narration of decline, which he calls the Desecration Phrasebook, while in 2014, the again eerily icy sounding Bureau of Linguistic Reality was founded to collect, translate, and create a new vocabulary for the Anthropocene. The question I tentatively pose here is how much does this different lexicon provide tools, or put another way, a way into recasting the pulse of 20th century human devastations in our Eastern European zone of interest and the impoverishment of its social fabrics. In other words, human ecosystems, in the light of what we now know, or ought to know, about the 21st century's perpetual biospheric emergency. Take the term perturbation as one example. Or tellingly, mental uneasiness. But it can also signify a deviation of a system, moving object or process from its regular or normal state or path, as caused by an outside influence. More specifically applied to ecosystems, perturbation is a temporary, quick change in environmental conditions that causes a pronounced great change in an ecosystem, altering the physical structure or arrangement of both biotic and abiotic elements. In truth, anthropogenic perturbations are so rampant as well as multifaceted that it is difficult to know where it all begins and ends, except perhaps with the word loss. The great US biologist E.O. Wilson in 1998 put it thus to an audience on Capitol Hill. Now, when you cut a forest, an ancient forest in particular, you're not just removing a lot of big trees and a few birds fluttering around in the canopy. You're drastically imperiling a vast array of species within a few square miles of you. The number of these species may go to tens of thousands. Many of them are still unknown to science, and science has not yet discovered the key role undoubtedly played in the maintenance of that ecosystem, as in the case of fungi, microorganisms, and many of the insects. What is significant about this statement, at least to me, is the implication of how oblivious most of us may have become, not just to nature's loss, but our own, unattuned to what what is there now as compared with a year, a decade, or a quarter century before, or simply having never been aware in the first place of habitats which have been eaten away or entirely erased for monocultural, monodirectional, usually state or corporate purposes, it is we ourselves who can no longer chart the year-on-year decline of sights and sounds, the natural background hum, indeed the mosaic of signals which would confirm the existence, the health of a thriving, flourishing planet. Or put more prosaically, when in this country, at least, did we last turn round and wonder at the sighting of a once common hedgehog or water vole, heard a cuckoo, saw a deceit of lapwings, a winter murmuration of thousands of starlings, or the gladdening flight of a kettle of swallows in a summer's sky? Does the accelerating die-off of many of the 1.9 million other species on Earth then have anything to say about human habitat loss, its consequent habitus erosion, the loss of dialects, languages, religious and social practices, psychic dislocation and trauma, social immiseration, not to say the actual extinction of human communities and collectivities, and what that might in turn do to the wider surviving human landscape, its social, cultural, and political fabric, its composure or otherwise debasement, after so many of its intrinsic elemental parts have been fragmented, shattered, or entirely ripped out. All those communities, all those continuities of the longue durée of human encounters ruptured forever. Is the dislocation and destruction of so-called minority peoples in Eastern Europe thus a harbinger, a chronicle of a more general and collective death foretold in the high era of the Anthropocene? Do our two narratives, natural and human, intersect through a minorities medium? Or again, alternatively, do we have to rethink or reinterpret that story differently in the light of what we know about the coming omnicidal catastrophe? In trying to fathom this imponderable question or set of questions, I was nevertheless reminded of another wonderful nature writer, more particularly celebrator of trees, the late, much lamented Roger Deakin. One of his travels abroad, courtesy of his companion Annette, seeking out the ancestral home of her father, took them on a trip into the Bieszczady Mountains at the intersection of the modern frontier between Poland and Ukraine. Here is a little extract from en route to their destination. The landscape is eerily empty. We seem to be crossing an immense plain of set-aside land. There aren't even any birds, except an occasional hooded crow picking about in a rubbish heap, and hardly a human figure, except for one or two old ladies bent over a cottage potato field. The land looks utterly spent, and rubbish blows about like tumbleweed almost everywhere. Little piles of charred cans and half-melted plastic bottles turn up in the middle of forests or line the banks of grey, lifeless reed beds. The only landmarks in this brown set-aside prairie of ravished earth are occasional empty concrete silos or electricity pylons. Here and there are pathetic patches of grass, parched, starved, and stunted, and not a farm animal in sight. No sheep, no cows or pigs. What is so depressing from this picture Deakin paints is, on the one hand, the desolation wrought on this once rural idyll, a form of ecocide to be sure. On the other, the absence of whoever the people were who once inhabited this now desolate region. Later on in the piece, Deakin does offer a grim paragraph on the unspeakable genocidal brutality which raised through Bieszczady during World War II, the gamut of perpetrators, and finally, the Polish communists' ethnic cleansing of perhaps 200,000 people at a few hours' notice, that in quotes, to other parts of Poland, and as he says, Russia. And here there is just a tiny glimmer of recognition of who these people were, by way of a tantalizing sentence in which he notes that in the last decade, this piece having been written in 2005 or 2006, some of the sons and daughters of these mountain people are now moving back into their original villages and towns. That aside, we do not get to engage with the Lemkos and Boyko, not through any failing of Deakin's, but probably because nobody could proffer the information to him. They and their cultures are instead magically disappeared, not because there are not people alive today who can trace their origins to these highland farmers, just as there are many Greeks and Armenians who can from Asia Minor, and doubtless a few Zamfjot Jews too. But after the uprooting and killing, there can be no seeming restoration to the way things once were, because the zone as zone in its range of human ecologies has been perturbed beyond repair. When I sought some years ago, for the volumes I was then writing on genocide, a term to describe the geographical region between the, in quotes, advanced metropolitan nation states of Western Europe and the still then extant heartlands of Ottoman, Habsburg, and Romanov empires at the turn of the 20th century, I plumped for rimlands as against other possibilities, primarily as a way of suggesting, on the one hand, a geopolitical zone of contestation, but also to try and encapsulate the human ethnographic aspects of the region itself. To be sure, its transitional aspect, but also its one distinctive and in some ways overriding feature, its ethno-religious richness and multi-faceted cultural diversity. Ironically, at the time, I did not know that a comparable term, edgelands, is used in this country and elsewhere by a range of geographers, psychogeographers, nature writers, and others to describe another liminal space between our cities and countryside. Everything is a bit messy, confused, and punctuated by ugliness in this space. An unofficial countryside, as the naturalist Richard Mabey called it in his famous Pathfinder study. But nevertheless, the notion of edgeland stands as a sort of contrarian's retort to the relentless, faceless, homogenizing, commodifying bulldozer of late neoliberal capitalism. Here, at least, there is something to hold on to, something even to celebrate in terms of the way the natural world carries on, breathes, even flourishes in the porous, ambiguous, overlooked interstices between the urban and industrial overspill. A small reminder, perhaps, but natural and human interactions on terms which are not dictated by either techno-corporate or statist come bureaucratic prescripts may yet offer alternative directions of travel. Of course, a big dollop of caution is required here before we get too rosy-eyed about either contemporary edgelands or historic rimlands. The latter world we have lost was, as Raz Siegel notes, not ideal transhumant or nomadic pastoralists or peasants, each ecologically adapted to their own valley, highland, plateau, or plain. Ubiquitous seasonal travelers like Roma, plus trading intermediaries, often Germans, Jews, Greeks, or Armenians, a multitude of ethnicities and faith groups, thus living cheek by jowl with each other. Cultural tensions were built in, especially where group identity was ambiguous. The jealous guarding of religious boundaries, often fierce. Economic and territorial disputes, sometimes explicit and violent. Even so, for hundreds of years at a local level, these many parts of Rimland society, both lay and clerical, managed synergies, interactions, crossovers, plus sensitivities to each other's practices without recourse to inherent and perpetual conflict. Politically, it was hardly a bundle of fun to be under Austrian, Ottoman, or Tsarist rule, especially the latter, in what Lenin described as the prison of peoples. Yet, under the radar of state interference and police surveillance, empathy, including in religious terms, had both the capacity to be both normal and uplifting. I think here on a personal level of another place to which I always insist on taking people on walking tours I co-organize in Salonika. The Sufi, more precisely Bektashi shrine of Musa Baba. Here, in what Mark Mazawa speaks of as overlapping devotions, the likelihood of seeing Greek Orthodox monks hanging out with Sufi sheikhs in the environs of the shrine was perfectly standard, while on holy days, all religious denominations in what was a many-faith city could be seen at the shrine paying their respects and exchanging gifts, as of course they did at each other's churches, synagogues, mosques, and tekkes. There again, on a more profane level, Christian women regularly came to Musa Baba to light candles or attach rags in trees to supplicate a saint they thought of as St. George, and who in their minds had been miraculously metamorphosed into a Muslim with suitably supernatural powers. Such behavior was necessarily anathema to the Greek authorities in the city post the Muslim expulsion in 1924, as it would have been to a Kemalist Turkey had Salonika remained within its fold. Of course, Mazawa's narration is famously of a city of ghosts. Even so, there was nothing at the time which would suggest the relationships between different groups were preserved in aspect. Salonika was increasingly vibrant, dynamic, as well as polyglot, even especially as political, cultural, social and cultural change, including the impact of Western economic penetration, created more cosmopolitan possibilities, just as was the case in a Chernovitz, an Odessa, a Lvov, or a Tbilisi, or any number of Rimland urban centers from fin de siècle, one could mention. But the mixed mosaic of Rimland's peoples ended up being apportioned as either part of, as Zygmunt Bauman would put it, anthropophagically assimilable majorities, or in the other camp, undesirable, if not insufferable minorities, to be thus anthropemically vomited out, only began to jaggedly crystallize as normative state and social practice when the difference between dominant and subordinate groups became nationally inscribed, more precisely within the essentially 20th century dispensation, certainly in that post-Chatterzone New Europe we call the nation state. Indeed, do we need reminding, back again to the lexicon, but as it became standard, what the word minority signifies. As Louis Wirth put it in 1945, minority is any group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, are singled out from the others in the society in which they live for differential and unequal treatment. But the term minority equally applies to an underage child, incapable of acting for her or himself. By extension, a minority is ipso facto undeveloped and hence incapable or unworthy of exercising self-determination. In a world of nation states, politically speaking, a foreign body such as this, must be either out of place, out of sync, or out of time. Minority, in other words, infers oddity, an unspoken assumption, yet formally corroborated in international legal terms by the quiet post-World War II burying of the Minorities Treatise. Put thus through a realistic lens, for all the murder and misery it entailed, the 20th century unmixing of peoples, Lord Curzon's at Lausanne effective legitimization of the fact, was a case of relieving a prescribed normative human condition of a set of insufferable anomalies. Put otherwise, through a 21st century climate lens, the ripping apart of almost the entire Rimland's fabric in 3 intense sequences, 1912 to 24, the first, 1938 to 53, an arguably even more dramatic second, 1990 to 99, a third tumultuous aftershock. These might be seen as major perturbations in a wider, ongoing Anthropocene disruption and destabilization of both human and natural ecosystems. Beyond that, if humans, whether with computers or quills, are around a further 50 or 100 years from now, trying to understand and record the significance of the Rimland's demise in terms of their own peril, they may well telescope the whole long 20th century, including interwar interregnum, even arguably more so Cold War era, into one long continuous moment of suffocation, obliteration, and ultimately flattening of anything which stood in the way of nationally mandated projects of monocultural homogenization. But in fact, we don't need to stare into this grim near future to be able to reap the consequences of all this right now. Just as Deakin's portrait of the Biashadi region is one of an aching absence, just as you won't hear the once common nightingale sing in Berkeley Square or anywhere else much in Britain. So, bar some folkloric event where exotic peoples are wheeled out to sing or dance in their quaint lingos for touristic display, social, religious, ethnic, and cultural difference is neither structurally embedded nor genuinely celebrated, that is, without reservation for its own sake, in any former Rimland polity. But from where we stand now, why should any of this matter? We can lament lost cultures and produce reams of nostalgia about them to our heart's content. But if humanity's post-Enlightenment transformational trajectory was always inevitable, ineluctable, the ethnic cleansing, the mass removals, the genocides included, what is the point in trying to recreate a present founded on submerged, invisible, or entirely extinct ethnies, lost or dying languages, buried fragments of intercommunal conviviality when that world has gone forever? To which I can only reply, fine, if you want to live on a dying planet. Nostalgia today has its modern Anthropocene equivalent in the term solastalgia, which its coiner, the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht, denotes as, in quotes, a form of psychic or existential distress caused by environmental change. Yet solastalgia implicitly also carries a warning about simply wallowing in this dis-ease. Because everything we know environmentally about well-being, or put differently, the resilience of species and communities of species across time and space, is founded on the wealth as well as depth and range of biotic diversity. Professor Susan Simard, a Canadian professor of forest ecology, for instance, has pioneered scientific research on how what she calls mother trees not only look after their young seedlings, but through a below-ground communications network, a wood-wide web of roots, mycelium, fungi, and nutrients, pass and share messages between themselves, even across species, to protect and enable the long-term cooperation and hence well-being of the whole multicultural forest community. Though the implications of tree sentience, agency, and memory were initially rubbished by her scientific peers, Simard's work is now acknowledged among a growing phalanx of biologists and ecologists who are demonstrating how what Simard has done for trees is at the literal root of symbiotic and reciprocal relationships, which together are the healthy sum of many parts, ourselves included. Compare and contrast that with almost everything we might say about the modern state system as essentially founded on national sacro-egoismo. The sanitized antithesis of Simard's forest, or thinking Bauman, the grass without the weeds, this human-fashioned system has inbuilt conditions for its own self-destruction. Again, why? Because here in 2021, as temperatures exponentially rise, as the Earth scientists have forecast, on the basis precisely of state-driven, developmentalist, fossil fuel-based trajectories, and with them rising sea levels threaten the very territorial integrity of these same nation states, they will in turn inevitably, necessarily resort to violence to defend that integrity. Most obviously, against the vast swathes of people from inundated and desiccated regions who, seeking refuge, encroach upon them, while at the same time deselecting from their already diminishing universes of obligation those deemed within their midst less worthy of state sustenance. In other words, refugees and asylum seekers, those who do not meet the majoritarian prerequisites for societal belonging, those still tainted as minorities. In a world on the brink in this way, it might well be then to pause and consider why the so-called minority question was and continues to be so fundamental to the nature of contemporary humanity, or at least its dominant hegemonic elements, wider political come environmental dysfunction. As the political elite come corporate-driven great transformation of the 19th century became the great and even greater acceleration and thus globalized system of the 20th, no alternative, more plural, negotiated framework could be allowed to stand in the way of rapid hothouse state developmentalism, whether dirigist or free market based. The idea of stasis risible, even slow speed change, anathema, rural backwaters, biographical no places, outmoded irrelevances, the notion of live and let live, a dinosaur, God forbid, Judaic moralism, as the drive to catch up and get ahead in the eternal nationally based competitive race for material transcendence and the commodification of everything became the only game in town. Only now, as the wheels come off the planetary train and hubris is confronted by nemesis, might there be a tiny glimmer of recognition that we, by which I mean the hegemonic Western we, somewhere critically along the line may have taken the wrong historical fork. But grand projects to realize the unrealizable were precisely that, and the contemporary architecture of today's monocultural, managed, technocratic, market, and profit, not to say plastic besotted world, is actually very brittle. That hardly has stopped the runaway train continue on its path to self-destruct. Nor is it any accident that the majority of today's frontline communities, exposed, diminished, diseased, and destroyed by the unsatiated drive for yet more fossil fuels, voracious mining extraction, oil pipelines, clear fell logging, and agro-industrial flex crop or beef cattle supersessions, are indigenous peoples, otherwise First Nations, the black, brown, and red of the global South, at odds with and out of sync with the, alas, yet to be vanquished behemoth of perpetual growth. They are today's first and perhaps last minorities, and they may be all that stands in the way of the final push to gobble up the remains of the global commons and thus realize not terrestrial fulfillment, but human foreclosure on this planet. It's time, as the radical historian of consciousness, Donna Haraway, has put it, to think, in quotes, outside the pricktails of humans in history, when the knowledge of how to murder each other, and along with each other, unaccountable multitudes of the living earth is not scarce. Simply, we must change the story. The story must change. Thank you.
Oh.
Phew. Can I go now?
Not yet.
Ouch. Oh dear.
Thank you, Mark. This was really thought-provoking and at times very pessimistic, I must admit.
Oh, sorry. I'm such a miserable sod, but there you go.
Well, but let's hope that kind of, meetings like this and discussions like this, could change some sort of attitude or at least understanding of the potential dangers of the future. So the floor is now open for discussion, and as said, you can either just raise your hand or put your question in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat and I can read out your question. Or you can just join and ask the question and or comment or suggestion or whatever.
Just to say, if you want to put your questions to the chat, make sure you address the questions to everyone, or just to Elena.
Yes. Anyone would like to start with the questions? Raul, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for a really interesting introductory lecture. Elena, you can't organize a conference called Being a Minority in Times of Catastrophe and then complain that the introduction is too pessimistic. Catastrophe is right there in the title. But I mean, this minor comment aside, my question to you, Professor Levene, would be if you think anything from the longue durée history of the Rimlands offers any kind of glimmer of hope in terms of potential solutions in the now regarding the coming ecological catastrophe, and if there is anything to learn from this pre-genocide, if you will, history of the region that might be of use today.
Well, I mean, I put out a provocation, and you're putting one back to me, which is good. And you know, the answer on one level, you know, one can be very glib about this. On one level, the answer is I don't know. You know, I think unfortunately, we are having to find ourselves in through a situation which is both unprecedented and precedented. And we're having to do it in a very short time frame, because where we are now, the Earth science tells us that very little time is left to sort this, very little. And that, unfortunately, you know, it's not pessimistic, it's just stating the truth. So that's one side of it. What I was trying, I think, to do in a very tenuous sort of way, tentative sort of way, was to say, look, what we know about nature is that it works well when there is a lot of interactions between different species, and they all relate to one another. And we're only now beginning to realize how deep that set of relationships is. What I was trying to say here was, maybe we need to relook at how people in the past have interacted, and to try and rethink, not that there was something entirely backward or outmoded about how people interacted in the past in a pre-modern or near-modern period, but that actually there were possibilities for coexistence which were over long periods of time. What I think we can learn today is how we have to, on one level, and it's crass to say so, we have to slow down. We have to take more time for other people. We have to be sensitive to difference, and that the difference may be valuable to our interactions. You know, the sort of societies we have created, on the one hand, they seem to allow for all sorts of difference, but they don't. Certainly not in genuinely levels of ecological relationship to time and place. And, you know, this is part why I was interested in what you wrote, Raul. But, you know, you take a particular group of people who are the lowest of the low in the European, you know, hierarchy. You know, you're not allowed to say so, but it is the reality when you spoke about Roma. Why is it that people who travel from place to place as seasonal migrants, why has that become such an oddity, so out of the normative reality? Perhaps, and there's a paradox here, of course, as well. And it was stated the other day about when the latest UN figures came out on people on the move, refugees, the term we use. We are all going to have to face the reality that there are going to be millions of people on the move in coming decades. Millions, if not billions. And we may be among them. How does interaction between different groups of people, what can we learn from this? What have we got to learn, not just in some technical sense, but maybe some cultural, religious sense about not killing each other? Maybe that's the first point I'm trying to sort of, but there has to be some way, if we are not to end up killing each other first, of finding ways in an equal way through, you again talk about it, the embedded structural nature of inequality. We're going to have to find ways at a local level as well as the grand political level of learning to appreciate each other's difference. And I suppose that's, it's built in this, the issue of climate change is not a technical problem alone. It's a religious problem, it's a social problem, it's a cultural problem. And that's what I'm, as I say, I'm nebulously just trying to reach out to what this means in human terms. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sam, you have a question. And then Francis.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, for that fascinating and, well, both fascinating and in many cases somewhat dispiriting talk.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it's these kinds of conversations need to be had. That's just the play. That's just the barefaced truth of the matter. But just to kind of on a slightly more technical aspect to your talk, because apologies if I show my my ignorance here, but I was just wondering, you were kind of discussing throughout the 20th century the interaction between both the state and sort of growth-driven capitalism, or what's now often termed late-stage capitalism, which is I would view as essentially the same thing as earlier stage capitalism, just on steroids, if you like. I was just wondering, and you sort of talk about how these two sort of systems and processes overlap and frequently converge. But I was just wondering, in our current system, ultimately, which of these would you say is the main driver of these of what essentially is this disaster? Would you say, is it the process of capitalism, or is everything still underwritten and underlined by this sort of entrenched nation-state system, specifically a kind of Western/Northern, the sort of hegemonic sort of Western/Chinese/Russian state system, if you like? Yeah.
That's a good question and an interesting one, to which I think, maybe as a group of people we can discuss further. Just a couple of further thoughts. One is, certainly not me being in some way exceptional here, I think the nation state is going to become more embedded as this situation becomes worse. I think we're seeing that, at a political level and also a populist level, and those two things embed. But as people become more insecure, they turn to the nation state for answers. Paradoxically, even when they may be doing so hoping that the state will give them more freedoms, nevertheless they do it in a implicitly majoritarian sense if they are part of that majority. And I think we're seeing this in so many places. The second thing I say about the relationship between corporate and state, and you just made me think of something I've just recently completed. I'm completing an exhibition with an associate. I mean, it should be obvious from where I'm coming from that I'm on that, is it a fringe? I'm in that minority of people who are shouting rather too loudly. No, we're just shouting about climate change, and we're trying to sort of try and find out what are the drivers. And I've just put an exhibition together on fossil fuels, and you know, we state who are the corporate criminals in this country: BP, Shell, Barclays, and the government, and together. And the BP government relationship has been described as one of revolving doors. So where does one begin and the other end? And I think what we're going to see over the next few years, I'm not an economist, I'm not, you know, I'm interested to see where this all goes and what the role of the corporate economy will be in terms of responding to climate change, because there has to be that response now. And I think what's going to happen is there is going to be more and more a corporate state nexus, which will be saying we've found this solution or that solution to the problem, which will be another version of the big lie. And until we get off this growth model, we are still on the great acceleration. And the corporate state nexus, like Roosevelt talked about the military industrial nexus in the 1950s, you know, what you're saying about capitalism, well, it is certainly on steroids, and it's certainly embedded with the state. And I don't know what the answer to that is going to be in terms of getting us off that. What I fear is that as the situation gets first, people will look to this nexus for answers, where it is actually the very toxicity of the nexus which is the problem. So, and yes, what can one, you know, you've raised it right at the beginning. There's almost something in the way we live now, where when it's not nice, is it? It's like giving a bad smell in a room to say this is how it is. It's very, very bad. And, you know, we're almost expected to find a sort of a nice answer. And of course, go to Shell and BP and they'll find you nice answers. They're lying. They're lying.
Or well, in Britain at least, the media just doesn't want to talk about it.
Mostly, yeah. Though there are exceptions to that. You know, I don't want to be blanket about it, but I think the wool will go on being poured over our eyes in particular ways, through greenwashing, through Boris coming on board and telling us what wonderful things he's going to do at the next great climate conference, COP26. And they will be cases, alas, of pulling the wool over our eyes. But there we are. I'm coming from a particular pessimistic position.
No, thank you very much.
Francis, you had a question too.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, I share your am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah. No, I share your intense antipathy to capitalism, and I think it's rather important to talk about the driving forces behind the ecological catastrophe in precisely those sorts of terms, because there is this illusion being put forward that it's somehow possible to consume your way out of trouble when in fact we're consuming our way into trouble. The question I wanted to raise was one of scale, though, because when you consider the magnitude of the ecological catastrophe, the global implications of it, the likely mass movements of refugees, the likely kind of wars, disasters, collapses in living standards, etc., 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 and the fact it's likely to happen several decades in the future. And when you then relate that to the short-term nature of our political cycles and the fact it's so much easier to get people fired up about nation, culture wars, religion, and that sort of thing. I mean, look at the politics of our 6 counties in Northern Ireland, for example, the minority politics par excellence. What are they obsessed about? Stuff that does not matter in the slightest. It has zero global implications whatsoever. And yet they are, that is all they are capable of getting worked up about. And this kind of pattern is replicated more or less across the entire world. Humans think on a human scale. They think on the scale of things they can understand and grasp. And I'm even more pessimistic than you as to whether it is possible for humanity and human social and political structures to grasp the nature of the problem we actually face and come up with solutions if such things are indeed possible. On the kind of global in which they need to happen, because of course ecology is relentless. You only have to look at the insects in your garden. One year you'll get loads of one species, another year you get loads of other. What happened to the ones who were all there one year? Well, we know what happened to them. Humans are not in any way immune from the same biological laws as the rest of nature. So I think I managed to be even more pessimistic than you. I'll throw that at you and leave it at that.
And I won't thank you very much, Francis. And how do you do? I won't actually respond. I mean, I think that's a throw into the discussion, and I won't respond per se at this moment in time. Okay.
Any more questions, perhaps? I actually also wanted to ask something, but it's not really a question. It's more like a comment, and it's kind of going back to the history, to what you were talking about, those experiences of minorities and population transfer and displacement and so on. When I was listening to this part of your conversation, of your talk, I was thinking that instead of studying those people who left and their experiences in a new kind of area, it's interesting to look at those people who actually stayed and what happens to them when this one element of their kind of ecosystem is gone. So because you showed it very convincingly that we are one kind of sort of organism where everything works, together and there is some kind of synchrony. But what happens if one element is out? What happens when Poles or Germans or Jews are out of this mix, of this mosaic? And indeed, I think it's not a question. It's just something that I was thinking, that perhaps we should also switch our attention in a different direction, also as a methodology for kind of studying and research. But this is just as kind of a thought, a comment. Yeah. Perhaps any more questions or thoughts in the chat as well, if you wish to ask something or comment or.
I think Stan has one.
Yeah, Stan.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Mark, and for a very insightful talk, and everyone else who contributed so far. I've got a couple of, so maybe two points that could be worth making. So one is I recently read a book by Michael Mann, who's a famous climate scientist. He's famous for the hockey stick, right? So he actually kind of shown to scientific community and broader community that is humanity that is responsible for global warming, right? It was back in 2008, 7, 8 or something. So his new book is called The New Climate War. And it is about many things, but in particular, it's about one, I think, big idea in there, is that the polluting industries, the carbon emitters. And Mark, obviously, with your work around fossil fuel industry, you'd be very familiar with this. So they gave up on the idea of denying climate change and denying the impact of climate change, right? Because it's impossible. Because you look at the news yesterday in southern Czech Republic in Moravia, and there's a huge tornado which has never happened there before, right? So it's impossible to deny the effects of climate change. But what they do now, right? They use the so-called deflection strategies, and this is BP's, Shell's, and JP Morgan's, and Barclays, right, and all of them. So what are these deflection strategies? They are saying, well, it's your fault, consumer. And you will see that on LinkedIn, on Facebook, etc. So people who work consultants for, like some of my former colleagues who are consultants for fossil fuel industry, the comments they make is, oh, why should we attack the polluting industries? We should think about our own consumption. What about our own air miles? What about our consumption of beef? And what about other things, right? So they're turning into a moral question, right, for everyone. And they literally, some of them point this, put this point clearly or explicitly that, it's your fault first, consumer. So if you want anything to change in climate, you need to, right? And Michael Mann is explaining, on the other hand, that scientific evidence for climate change is obviously there, clearly. The IPCC reports are a good starting point. But what he's saying primarily is that to actually change anything materially in terms of climate warming, right, which is our main risk at the moment, we need to decarbonize industry, decarbonize transport, and decarbonize infrastructure, right? To do all of these things, consumer is nowhere near these things, right? So the state will need to come in and do it, right? So we as voters will have to vote for it because it will involve some, taxes and levies and other things we'll need to incur. And then, so the killer point, right, is that there's research that says that people who use carbon calculators are less likely to vote for carbon taxes, right, or price of carbon. So this is the deflection strategy laid out, right? Mm-hmm. So basically by saying it's your fault, right, people start using carbon calculators and thinking, oh, how much do I need to switch to a cleaner energy plant, right? So they just do all these things. And then they are less likely to vote for higher taxes for BPs and Shells, right? And that's it. So I think what we need to be careful of when we talk about these things, right, is we don't want to be part of that propaganda unwittingly, right? Because we're all very good at pointing fingers at each other and say, oh, you consume more, so right. So that's that's my one point. And can I just rest it there for a second? And then my question to Mark actually is that you mentioned nationalism, right? And you mentioned people who were sent out of Turkey, Greeks who were sent out of Turkey, and Muslims who were sent out of Salonika, right? So that's absolutely, that history is driven by nationalism, right? So if we think that nationalism was obviously very strong at the beginning of 20th century, and then it was kind of tamed, right? Because it was destroyed, extreme nationalism was destroyed by the Second World War, by defeat of fascism, right? So that's one thing. And maybe the other aspect of why it was tamed, 50s, 60s, 70s, nationalism was tamer than it was earlier. It could be the threat of communism, right? So capitalists were more prepared to build a welfare state because they were afraid of communism coming in and doing it differently, right? So they were prepared to give pensions, prepared to give unemployment benefits, to build medical services, right, in the West, because they knew that Soviet Union had an alternative, right? So you have this kind of ideology, right? You have the Cold War actually helping maybe the welfare states in the West in some ways. And then when Soviet Union fell apart, right, welfare states starting to become brittle, right? Because neoliberalism, right? And all this. So nationalism is back now, right? So what could help tame it again? Could it be that actually climate emergency could be the that threat, like the Soviet Union of the past, right, that will actually help people, that different systems, right, China, Russia, well, not Russia so much, but China coming out saying by 2060, we're going to be carbon neutral, right? That's unprecedented, right? So could it be that actually it might help people to realize there's common threat, we need to do something about it? So I'll leave it there.
All right, quick response. I mean, I thought that was what you said about the Michael Mann book. I haven't read the recent Michael Mann book, but you're almost doing a great plug for that. And Michael Mann is one of the people who is, has put his head above the parapet beyond being a climate scientist to saying, these are the people who are responsible, and that critique you offered is educational. Thank you. And I like it's neat what you're offering as a sort of, the welfare state in the past, communist threat, now climate change. That's going to keep nationalism at bay. I'm pessimistic on that score, because I think as the situation gets worse, people will go for what is available. And I'll tell you something worse. We talked about, through Sam earlier, we talked about corporate state nexus. What's in the wings here is the big response, the sort of the global universal response, which will be technocratic corporate state. And it will all be about geoengineering. It will be about how do we keep this thing from overwhelming the system as it is. And that will be mega state, but it will be big state led. It will be the most advanced hegemonic states who will lead this. And they 10, 20 years down the road, when it becomes clear, because you see at the moment we're talking about, we're going to keep this within 1.5 or 2 degrees. No scientists believe this. Scientists don't know that this is just rubbish. We're talking about 3 or 4 degrees minimum rise in temperature. So how is this going to be stopped? Well, there are only two routes, actually. It goes back to what you were saying earlier. We must learn to live much gentler, less consuming lifestyles globally. How do we do that? No idea. No answer. Except by creating a more equal society, which is a sort of almost in this day and age revolutionary as a concept. Now, I don't want, I'm an anti-Soviet sort of thinker in this sense. The alternative is you go for the military, industrial, corporate state nexus, which equals geoengineering. That, I don't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in it. It's terrifying. It makes all the totalitarianisms of the 20th century seem silly by contrast. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic about this, but we have to find a different way. And I think it actually has to come from below in some sense, if it's only pushing the state to change. After.
We have one more question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Nice to meet you.
Daniela, you need to unmute if you...
You're quite quiet again, Delena.
Sorry, Daniela, we have a question. You also wanted to ask a question.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Levene, for your unusual point of view. Thank you also, Lena and Sam, for hosting today. I was wondering, what is your opinion when a minority becomes the ruling class? Is it worse for the national minorities in that case? For example, here in Banja Luka in 1878, when the Austro-Hungarian army came, they burned the only Sephardic synagogue. And we have here in Bosnia a lot of similar examples. What is your opinion of that?
Well, you're putting me on the spot here. Who are you specifically referring to? In this particular case, the Austro-Hungarian empire coming into Bosnia and taking over? Is that the?
Not just that example. That's just one of the examples. But when a minority becomes the ruling class, is it then more dangerous for the other minorities? Are they more aggressive? What's your opinion?
I don't know that there's a one size fits all. I mean, you know, one could look at certain examples. I mean, I suppose the most recent example which immediately springs to mind is Syria. And Syria had an Alawite minority ruling the country, which was actually quite good for other confessional communities, in the sense that it allowed them the possibility of existence in a region where that sort of difference was being suffocated slowly and slowly. But set against what has happened since then, of course, that minority rule was clearly a disaster. But I'm not sure, you know, I think in a way you're posing a huge question about the relationship between a minority rule can of course be, it doesn't necessarily have to be ethnic. It can be a very specific group of people, you know, again, Saddam Hussein, you know, the Tikriti grouping around him ran the country. This is clearly not, this is clearly a basis for inequality, objections, resistance, dissent, or whatever. So clearly a minority ruling ruling other minorities and majorities is also a recipe for a disaster. What I was trying to suggest was it's a synergy and reciprocity between groups, which that has the potentiality for things working in a more resilient and sustainable fashion from a naturalist's point of view. Now, how you translate that into human systems may be difficult from the place at which we have arrived in the 21st century. Not a very good answer, but it's an attempt.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Barbara, you also want to ask a question, and perhaps we will make it the last question.
Then we can have some lunch.
Yes. Thanks, Elena. Yeah, and thank you, Mark. That was just so fascinating. I just had a rather sort of general question, which you might not even want to attempt, but it was to do with what your thoughts might be. You know, you talked about historical examples, but also you're looking to the future and you're looking forward at what is to come, or I don't know if looking forward is quite the right word, it's so pessimistic. But what do you think the track record is of historians trying to sort of project into the future like that? You know, do you have any view about how useful it can be to do that, to sort of come at it from a historical point of view and try and see what the future might be?
That's a very interesting question. And yes, and in a way, it's look. I mean, I am a deviant in the historical sense. I've gone where I shouldn't have gone. I think historians, there's something about the nature of disciplines. You know, this is again part of the modern world where, though we're encouraged to be multidisciplinary, sometimes actually, that in a sense is also a sort of a dodgy exercise. Actually, most historians prefer to stay within their comfort zones. You know, they put a lot of effort into studying their particular area of interest. and that's understood. And you know, looking into the future is not what historians do. That's for other people. One of the reasons I got into history, well, I was always into history, was I was interested in where we're at now and what the, you know, which shouldn't be such an odd idea, and how the past informs the where we're at now. I think the great challenge, as well as sadness, of where we're at now is we can do no other, because as human beings, we are all faced together with this same problem. It's, you know, the global universal nature of it. It's going to affect us all, though unequally to begin with, because it will be the most poor, lacking in privilege, disenfranchised communities which are suffering now the worst from it. But ultimately, it's going to be all of us. So I think we have a responsibility as human beings, but also as historians, to try and draw from the past to try and respond to the future. And I think if we leave it to the technocrats and the geoengineers and the Borises and the Shells, we are failing. That's my response, Barbara. And hello.
Hello, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for these fantastic questions and the discussion. And I guess we will now have our short break, and we can reconvene perhaps 1:45 to 2. Yeah. And yeah, we will have an excellent opportunity to draw from the past in our sessions in this afternoon. So thank you once again to Mark and to everyone. Sorry, Sam.
Just a quick announcement for those of you who showed up a bit late. Don't worry, this is being recorded and will be publicly available as soon as possible. So don't worry, you will have a chance to review, to watch again.